welcome to this segment of our core series webinar. Hi, I'm Jason Rose, speaking from our BigFoot Car Detailing Academy in Denver, Colorado. We also have as a co-presenter my esteemed colleague in Italy, Fabrizio. Go ahead and say hello, Fabrizio.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to this new episode of the core series. I hope you will find today's webinar interesting, engaging, and hope you will participate with lots of questions and all what you need. We are here for you.
Okay, thank you. And then running background with complete control is our magnificent marketing guy, Dylan Von Kleist. He's in the background there, and he'll be coming in and out as we present this very exciting topic. So what I want to do first of all is say welcome and thanks for taking the time to watch this particular segment. We have a very exciting topic for you. And before we begin, want to actually educate you a little bit on the webinar controls. So you have some control of the interface on your screen. So what you can see there is some boxes, and one of the boxes has the speaker camera, and that you can actually move around on your screen. You can enlarge it, you can shrink it. You simply click and drag, and you can manipulate that particular box, the presenter camera box. Secondly, we have the box that has the actual content, our presentation slides. You can also move those around and enlarge and shrink those as you wish. Additionally, there's another box called the Q&A box, and this is where you can engage us. This is where you can insert a comment, you can insert a question. Please understand that when you type in this particular chat box, there is a delay before we actually get it. Dylan will be running this chat box in the background, but what I'd like to do is let's just verify and make sure this is working for you. I'd like for each of you to actually type in that Q&A box and type in the city and the country that you're in. We have some viewers from all over the world at the moment. This is a very strong topic. Our pre-registration was really strong. So go ahead and type in there now. Type in the city and the country that you are in, and we can just verify that that function's working for everyone. Additionally, we have another box that's called downloads, and downloadable resources for this topic will include some material about the topic and some catalogs and other things that might be of use to you. You can actually download that material at any time during the presentation or after. There's also this other box over to the right there that has the presenter and the trainer contact info. This is information about us, how to reach us. So with that, we want to present this topic, and it has been published as the 15 millimeter versus 21 millimeter, but the main emphasis of this topic is about orbit sizes and the impact of orbit on performance of polishing and sanding. So we want to focus your attention to a specific tool movement. So there's many different types of tool movements. We are, for today's topic, talking about a very specific movement, and it is the dual action random orbital tool movement. So this entire topic is about that specific movement. And then to further expand the topic, we are specifically talking about large orbit for that particular tool movement. And then in addition to that, we're going to weave in some features and benefits of our new version of our dual action random orbital large orbit tool, which is our Mark III. So the topic is going to be presenting you information about orbit sizes and its impact on performance, which, by the way, is relevant for any of the tools in that category. So this is education, but at the end, we'll also give you a little bit about our product, our new Mark II version. So before we begin, we want to ask some questions of you. We want to gather some information from you at this moment. So on your screen, you should see a question. And the question is, in your opinion, all other variables being equal, which tool cuts faster? And what we are doing is comparing the 15mm BigFoot tool to the 21mm BigFoot tool. And if you can just insert your answer there, which will either be you believe the 21 cuts faster, or you believe the 15 cuts faster, or they both cut about the same. And by the way, cut, we mean defect removal power. Or you don't know, and that's why you're on this webinar. So go ahead and click in your answer at this time. Give a couple more seconds for everyone to enter their answer. And thank you for your feedback on this. Now, this next question is about the finishing side of paint correction. So the question is, in your opinion, all the variables being equal, which tool do you believe finishes better? So the 21mm Orbit or the 15mm Orbit tool, or they have about the same finishing ability, or you don't know. Go ahead and enter your answer there. All right, hopefully we've captured a bunch of your answers. So with that, let's present to you a summary of your responses. So within this audience that's watching this webinar at the moment, your opinion is that 42% of you believe the LHR21 cuts faster, followed by 22% of you believe the 15mm cuts faster. And then about 14% say it cuts about the same. And then 20% you don't know, which is perfect because that's why you're here. So we'll go to the next question, which was on the finishing side. We have a great majority of you, 34%, believe the 15mm finishes better, with 9% feeling like the 21mm finishes better. 28% believe they finish the same, and a good 28% also don't know, which again is absolutely fabulous because that means our content today is going to be very relevant to you. Okay, so the specifics of what we're about to present to you. We are first going to talk generally about Orbit and what an Orbit is relative to this particular tool movement. Then we're going to talk about the impact of small and large orbits and its impact on performance. With that, we're going to get very deep into comparing performance under certain situations. And finally, we will finish with an overview of the Mark III and some of the changes that have gone through with that version of our tool. And with that, we will start with understanding Orbit. Today, we also have George. George is not speaking today because he's cardboard and he doesn't speak very much. But fortunately, we have Fabrizio in Italy that's going to go over understanding Orbit. So I'll shift this over to Fabrizio to explain that segment.
Thank you, Jason. I think George could have done this webinar much better than you and I, but that's okay. Our audience will accept us. Okay, so the first topic is understanding Orbit, understanding the movement. So we are talking about one movement, which is the random orbit movement that has been the game changer in the last 10 years in the polishing. Why this? Because we know that we have so many advantages using a random orbital polisher compared to gear-driven, or even more compared to rotary polisher. But today we are not making a comparison between different movements. We are focusing on the random orbital movement and what it is. So what is a random orbit? It's a dual action. We all know it's called dual action. Why? Because we have orbit and rotation that are joined together, but with a difference. There is one movement, which is the orbit, that is forced. So the motor makes this movement, makes the orbit, and this is the main movement. So of the dual action, there is one action that is the main one, the more important one. It is the one that is doing the job, actually. And there is one movement that is ancillary, that is secondary. It is not the main, the most important one. It's the less important one, but it's nevertheless very important. Random orbital is actually a wrong definition for two reasons. First, it is not the orbit that is random, and second, it is the rotation that is random. So it is a random rotary, but forced orbital polisher. What is the reason why we have the rotation? This is the movement now, so we have the rotation, we have the orbit happening together. The orbit is the dominant one, doing the bulk of the work, so main part of the job. If we consider, for example, a gear-driven, which is also a dual action, but in that case, the main movement is the rotation, and the orbit is helpful only to reduce the evidence of holograms and other defects. Instead, the main job is done in the gear-driven by the rotation. Here we have the exact opposite situation. Here, the main and the most important movement, the one that is doing the job, that is removing defects, is the orbit, while the rotation is there for some reasons, is very important, but anyway not as important as the orbit. The movements, the reasons why we have the rotation are to help to have a safer polish, to have a better cooling of the surface, of the pad, of the system altogether. And especially, for me, the main reason why the rotation is so important is that it gives you this random element, which gives you gives to the abrasive the possibility not to repeat the same circle, the same path all the times, so to move in different directions, and in the end we don't have overlapping of the scratches that we do to the paint, but to make a very even and defect-free effect. That's why the random orbital movement is the only one that doesn't substitute a big defect with a smaller one, but that just removes defects without creating other defects. RUPES hasn't been the company creating the random orbital polisher. There were already before. The orbit is stroke, length, also throw. These are different words to say the same thing, okay? The orbit is the measure of the distance that the pad does during the movement. So this is what the orbit is, and that length is very important. As I was telling, BigFoot is not the first random orbital. We also, as RUPES, had a random orbital polisher before the BigFoot. But the problem was the stroke length, the dimension of the orbit. 8 millimeters. 8 millimeters is not enough to call one random orbital polisher a real polisher. It is good only for removing very minor effect. That's why random orbital polishers with 8 millimeters, they were called anti-hologram polishers, because you had to do the job with a rotary, with all the problems that you can get from a rotary, overheating, pad drag, and nasty work, and so on, and then finish with an 8 millimeter, 9 millimeter polisher, random orbital, but only the finishing. So that's why we have created, for example, as the first tool, the 21. 21 means 262% more of orbit, more than double, 2 times and a half more. This is a polisher. This is something that you can use to remove defects and to do the whole job. Almost always with just one step, sometimes with two. Rarely, very rarely, only with very difficult paints, very black colors, 3 steps. But if you need 3 steps with a random orbital like a 21, it means that you need 4 or 5 steps with a rotary, because in that case, the defects will be very hard to remove. Same story for the BigFoot 15 millimeter. 15 millimeters is 187 times % more than 8 millimeter. Even 12, which one might say, okay, 12, 8, is not that big difference, but it's 150% more. With this kind of polisher, you can do the job. That's been the real revolution given by the random orbital BigFoot system, because you have now the possibility to work with a random orbital polisher and do the whole job from the defect removal down to the finishing. Many times, again, using just one step. Now, the line goes back to Jason for the impact of orbit size, and we will talk again later.
All right, thank you, Fabrizio, for that. We will dive deep into this topic now and kind of dissect what we mean by orbit and the performance variables involved. So what we want to do now is actually compare the behavior of a small orbit to the behavior of a large orbit polisher. And again, we are speaking about a dual action random orbital movement. So there's certain characteristics, generally speaking, about a small orbit. And one of them is just reduced linear pad movement. What this means is if you take the orbit, which is a circle, and if you took that circle and straightened it out to a straight line, that would be the linear pad movement. And small orbit tools have less of this compared to large orbit tools. The other characteristic is pad velocity. This is how fast the pad is moving. So orbit contributes to this pad velocity in addition to several other things. But all things being the same, small orbit compared to large orbit, the pad will be moving at a reduced velocity with smaller orbit. And then another characteristic is the actual material removal, and this is the rate of paint removal. And I'll remind you that when we are removing defects, scratches and things like that, we are actually removing the paint around the scratch. So with a small orbit scenario, that material removal rate is reduced compared to a larger orbit. We also have this other characteristic about precision being slightly more as your orbits get smaller. And the reason for this is any offset at all in the orbital pattern reduces precision, specifically talking edge edgework. And that is the outside edge of painted panels on a car or peaks, contours, and things like that. The precision as you get larger and larger in orbit is less and less. So the smaller the orbit, the more precise the movement is. And then finally, the fifth characteristic is about the pad load. So as we mentioned, when we're removing defects, we are removing paint. Where does that paint go? It goes into the pad. Relatively speaking, large orbit to small orbit, that pad load will be more concentrated in a smaller area with a smaller orbit tool. It simply means that because of less linear pad movement, the material we're removing doesn't have very much room to go. So it kind of moves around in one small place. So with that, we'll compare large orbit behavior and, specifically about small orbit as a category. There's lots of tools in the dual action random orbital category, and 9 millimeter or smaller is what we consider a small orbit. So large orbit, we're talking about orbit sizes that are 10 millimeter or larger. That would be considered large orbit category. So the behavior regarding large orbit polishers is compared to small orbits, we have more linear pad movement. And again, we take the orbit circle, make a straight line. The line is now longer with a larger orbit. So that simply means the pad is traveling a further distance. Now, increased pad velocity, we assume that with small and large orbits, the movement is happening in the same amount of time. So pad velocity would need to be greater with a larger orbit. And that is a simple behavior characteristic of larger orbit tools. Also, the material rate is faster. Because of this extra pad velocity, extra linear pad movement, the material rate is greater compared to smaller orbit tools. And less edgework efficiency. Now, what we mean by that is if you take a large orbit tool, the outside pad diameter, and it's usually the distance from the backing plate to the outside of the pad itself, that is the least efficient in terms of defect removal because of its large offset. So any large orbit polishers, this is one of the characteristics, is that on the outside edge of the pad, that is the least efficient defect removal and finishing ability compared to the middle of the pad. So we also want to say that in that respect, it has less edgework efficiency. Now, the rate of pad or disc loading is reduced, which is counterintuitive a little bit, because earlier we just said that the rate of material removal was greater with a large orbit tool. But the characteristic combined, all things combined, what we're saying is that once you remove material from the surface, it's now on the pad, but now it's spread out over a further distance. So the load in each area on the pad is now going to be slower. You still get pad load, but it will be relatively slower compared to a small orbit polisher. So hopefully you understand the differences there. And we want to talk further about some assumptions with large orbit polishing. And we want to make sure you understand that just because it is a large orbit, that is not the only reason that you're getting the boost in performance that we all know and love. So there's other reasons. So the outer pad diameter actually plays a role in performance. So this actual diameter of the tool, or the pad on the tool, has an impact on performance. So it's not only orbit that is contributing to the result you get. Also the tool speed, and more on that later, but the actual motor speed of the tool combined with the orbit, combined with the pad diameter, all those things are working together to create the result you're getting. Also, the material of the pad itself. And from a previous webinar, hopefully you watched our pad comparisons webinar, but there are three major types of materials with pads. There's wool material, there's a microfiber material, and there's foam. And if you put any of those materials combined with the orbit, combined with the pad diameter, combined with the motor speed, it will have an impact on performance. And there's a little subnote there about pad drag. That is the friction and the resistance of the pad to the paint surface. So this contributes to performance as well. Additionally, the thickness or the type of compound or polish you're using will contribute to that result as well. And probably the most impactful variable is the technique of the user. So that's how you would use this orbit, this pad diameter, this motor speed, and the pad material. So it has a dramatic impact on performance. So the main point of this slide and this message is that we don't want you to get the message that just because you have a large orbit, that is directly contributing to your performance. So it is one of the contributing factors, but the orbit size is not the end-all, be-all of performance. It's simply more complex than that, and it's not as simple as the orbit equals great performance. There's a lot of other things going on. So with that, we want to dive into what are those other things going on. So we're going to compare the 15 millimeter BigFoot tool to the 21 millimeter BigFoot tool. And before I go into this, I just want to preface by saying we understand that there are strong preferences in this comparison. And you're watching this now, and some of you actually have a very, very strong preference towards the 21 millimeter version of the tool. And then there are others of you that have a strong preference towards the 15 millimeter version of our large orbit polisher. I personally am on the side of the 15 millimeter. That's my preference. I use them both. But my main point here before we go further is we're not trying to take that away from you. If you have a strong preference, that's fantastic. And you have developed and practiced and optimized your technique, and you like that version of our offering, our tool offering. And we're not trying to change that. We're not trying to talk you out of anything. But this next few slides is the education part. And there's also a large segment of you out there in the audience that have not completely come to the conclusion about what your preference is. So this is to help. This is to help understand the differences and to help you make an informed choice on which one you prefer, or in my case, you actually use them both. So it's to help you if you're not fully understanding which choice you prefer. If you already know your preference, then maybe this information we're about to present is going to help you understand why you prefer that preference. So here we go. So comparing these two, as I mentioned, a lot of you are wondering which one is better for me. Why would I choose one over the other? What scenarios does one perform better than the other? So let's go into this. Now, the very first thing to talk about is the tool speed. It is one of the most important contributions to performance when you're comparing these two orbit sizes and these two tools. So what we have here is we're going through our now 3 generations of our BigFoot random orbital tool. There is what we call our ES, which is the first generation. What you see on your screen is the tool range, the speed range of the 15 millimeter compared to the 21 millimeter. And that's the entire speed range from settings 1 all the way up to speed setting 6. So you'll see those ranges there. First thing to note right off the bat is the 15 millimeter tool speed range is higher on the 15 millimeter. Remember that? We have another point on that in a few minutes. Then we went into our Mark II version. We boosted the motor speed in both the 15 millimeter and the 21. However, the 15 millimeter again had a greater speed range. What we've done with the Mark III, you'll notice there, is that on the low end, you'll see that we've increased the orbits per minute on the initial speed settings 1, 2, and 3. And this actually is because of another feature built into the Mark III version, and that is the progressive trigger technology put into that tool. Fabrizio will talk more about that in a few minutes, but you'll see we've done some speed module modifications and motor speed changes, and it's because of the variable speed trigger. And then we also have optimized the peak performance. This is what we call where you can consistently get the best performance is in speeds 3 and 4 for the Mark III version. So we've kind of remapped things. We've readjusted some speed, put more orbits from here over to here, and that's what we've done with the Mark III, but more on that in a moment. The main point of this slide is I just wanted to make sure you understood that the speeds are not the same between the 15 and the 21. So as I mentioned, all things being the same, 15 millimeter BigFoot tool compared to the 21 millimeter BigFoot tool, you will find higher speeds in every setting on the 15 millimeter, sometimes up to 800 orbits per minute difference from one tool to the next. So the other thing to point out is the orbit size, which you've already been acquainted with, is 15 millimeter to 21. Now, this is where some differences get pretty dramatic. On these two tools, the 15 millimeter tool is set up with a 150 millimeter backing plate, or pad diameter, sorry. And the 21 is set up with an 180 millimeter or 7-inch. So the two tools have different pad diameters. And the difference is 18%. So if you look at this visually, it doesn't seem like a big dramatic difference, but 18% when you're talking about polishing impact, it's dramatic. The other thing that we've already mentioned, but to say again, is that the speed module programming, and this, by the way, is one of the great features of our company, is that we make our own motors and we program our own speed modules. So we have the ability to get specific on performance in a way that is second to none. So in this case, between these two tools, the 15 millimeter and the 21, we have remapped the speed modules, and that is to accommodate the orbit size, the pad diameter, and all the other forces that are in play between those two tools. And then another important thing is the eccentric set. This is the balancing system in the tool, and if this wasn't engineered very precisely, it would result in a vibration that's felt by the user, which is very, very important to us. We have taken a lot of time and effort and money to actually design this eccentric set very, very precisely. And what you'll see here is we have weight mated the backing plate and the pad weight for the eccentric set. So any dual action random orbital tool, when the pad and the backing plate is swinging on one side, the opposing side has an equal weight. It's called weight mated. So if they are exactly the same, then it would be a very smooth running experience. So with that, let's talk about performance actually in certain scenarios as you're polishing on paint. So we've talked about edgework efficiency already. Edgework is the outside 2 inches of every painted panel. It's peaks and contours in the body panel, or tight areas, little areas around the car. So between these two tools, if you were to compare them to each other on edgework efficiency, we would say that the 15 millimeter tool is better in this respect. The 21 certainly does edgework. A lot of you out there use the 21 on all parts of the car, and we're not saying that's not possible. What we're saying is between the two tools, the 15 millimeter and the 21, the 15 millimeter tends to be a little bit less technique dependent on edgework. You can do it with the 21, but you have to learn how to do that with the larger pad diameter and the larger orbit. Another comparison we can make is the actual style of the end user. So we have detailers, we have car enthusiasts, we have body shops and collision repair centers. Now the body shop scenario is different. A lot of cases, the panel is painted, sanded, and polished off the car many times. Not all the time, but many times. And in this scenario, the 15 millimeter version actually is better in that respect because you can run the polisher over the edge, no problem. The 15 millimeter does a good job in this scenario, but again, if you're comparing them to each other, the 21 millimeter would have a slight advantage in the body shop. Now, detailers and DIY, which is do-it-yourself, a car enthusiast, we would lean on the side of the 15 millimeter polisher as being slightly better in this scenario. And the reason is because it tends to be a little bit less technique dependent. Bigger the pad diameter, the more pad drag, and the more you have to think about pad rotation. So the 21 is a little bit more thoughtful in that area. And again, most of you using the 21, if you love the 21, you have already gone past that and you've figured it out. Next is on curves and contours. This is panels that are not flat. We would give a slight edge to the 15 millimeter version as being a little bit better in that respect, mostly because of pad diameter size. So imagine going over curves and contours with a 150 millimeter pad compared to the larger 180 millimeter pad. It would simply roll and curve and go in contours a lot easier. And that, by the way, has nothing to do with the orbit. It's a simple pad diameter thing. Next is the actual size of the vehicle. And as you can imagine, the larger the vehicle, the more flat, wide open spaces. The 21 millimeter would handle that area slightly better. Now here's where it gets fun. Finishing ability and cut rate or defect removal rate, we are saying are similar to each other. So when you directly compare the 15 millimeter polishing system to the 21 millimeter system, our expectation from the engineering side, from our company expectation, is that on an isolated defect, you would get similar defect removal rate and similar finishing ability. Now there's a long list of exceptions to that statement, and most of you know what I'm talking about, but generally speaking, these two should be head-to-head on an isolated defect in cut and finishing ability. Now, to do that properly, to validate that, which you can do yourself, we've done on our side, but it takes a very controlled test to validate this because you have to control for a lot of things: tool speed, pad diameter, the depth of the defect on both sides of the test. There's a long list of things, but it can be done. And when you do it, you'll find out that they're very similar. So some of you might be thinking, in fact, some of you actually have done this, where, hey, if I just take the smaller diameter from the 15 millimeter tool, if I take that smaller diameter backing plate and smaller diameter pad, and I put it on the 21 millimeter tool and reduce pad diameter. This is something that some people have done, and you might be thinking, well, hey, based on what Jason, you just told me, I should expect better performance with that smaller diameter. Now, we don't encourage you to do this for the following reasons. It's not a little change to go from the 150 millimeter pad to 180 millimeter pad, all other things being the same. So let's dive into this. When you change the backing plates, the backing plate weight itself should be very similar from tool to tool. However, the pad material is not. And we're going to use this as one example. There's lots of different pad materials and different diameters, but let's take this scenario of the average foam pad in our product line in the 150 millimeter size compared to 180 millimeter. You're actually changing the weight of the material by about 49%. That's the difference between the weight of those two pads. And again, the backing plate should be weighted about the same. So 49%, which is very close to 50%, that is a dramatic difference in weight. What we've learned is that even a 5-gram difference on these tools dramatically throws off the balancing. So it's not a little change, it's a dramatic change. The other thing to point out is pad diameter. So the outer diameter, the difference there is 18%. Some people look at these two pads and think, wow, that's, there is a difference, but, it's an 1.5 inch difference. So what's the big deal? Well, it actually is an 18% difference in diameter. This translates into surface area that is very dramatic difference. 176 square centimeters for the 150 millimeter pad. That is the actual calculated surface area. Compare that to the larger pad, which is about 254 square centimeters. The difference is 36%. So when you combine these variables, a simple backing plate diameter change from one tool to the next, which means a pad diameter change, it's not a little change, it's a significant one. And we want to make this point clear that it's not a very subtle difference, but a big one. Now, the other thing I want to say about vibration is that vibration is a variable that is, it's more sensitive for some people than others. So vibration in hand tools from one person to the next, some people are very sensitive to changes in vibration, others are not. So you might be sitting there thinking, well, oh, I did the backing plate change and it doesn't change the vibration that much, and I do cars every day, and you would be absolutely right. But that scenario is not the same for everybody. So there are sensitive people to vibration. And there's also regulations in Europe that are very specific about changes in vibrations of hand tools and how many hours you can actually use them. There's a regulated limit. So the point of all this is changing that diameter does impact balancing, which does impact vibration, and that's important to us. We want you to have a smooth running tool. The other thing you might be thinking of is, what about this washer modification that some people are doing? If you're not familiar with this, it's actually taking the backing plate and the shroud gap, putting a gap in there, so you actually put a washer in between this point and bring the backing plate away from the shroud contact. What we want to say about this is the washer modification, which is part of a list of mods that some people do to our tools. Some people remove the shroud itself. Some people change the cord to a different diameter or gauge cord. Some people are changing backing plate diameter. So what we're basically saying is, as a company, we don't really endorse any modification to the tool. Lots of you do it. Lots of you have claimed better performance. We're not disputing that. What we're saying is that when you make a modification like that, then the results are on you. So we haven't validated every single possible scenario of validation or modifications that people can do. So we don't really endorse any mod to our tool. It does not, in fact, void your warranty. Like some distributors actually believe this, but that's not the case. It might be the case if there was some direct evidence that the modification you did actually caused a tool failure, but that evidence is hard to gather. So what we're saying is it's not going to void your warranty, but we also say we don't recommend it, don't endorse it, and you're on your own in terms of what happens. All right, so to conclude on these comparisons, we want to say it is a fact that the 21 millimeter tool has a 33% orbit size advantage. We already talked about the advantage of large orbit. There are some disadvantages, but if we talk about advantages, the orbit size is 33% larger than the 15 millimeter, which does contribute to performance. However, the 15 millimeter tool, as it's designed, has a smaller orbit, however, higher motor speed, smaller pad diameter. So the engineering attempt by these two versions of the tool is that they end up in the same place. So the LHR 15 is making up for some ground lost by a large orbit. And by the way, 15 millimeter is still considered large orbit. It's just not as large as the 21 millimeter. And it is a fact based on a very structured test that most people are not doing. I've witnessed a lot of people comparing the 15 millimeter performance to the 21 millimeter performance, and the test is not valid based on the structure of the test. But if you do a proper test, you'll find that there is similar defect removal and finishing ability between these two tools. What you see here is our BigFoot dual action random orbital family of tools, and there's a reason why it's a family. If one size tool did everything that we needed to get done, we would have one tool. The fact is that we all offer different orbit sizes and different pad diameter sizes and different motors, different design tools. And the reason is because there is peak performance with a large orbit and there's peak performance with a smaller orbit. We actually offer large full-size tools and small tools to accommodate the variety of peak performance. So we're actually proposing a multi-tool method is where you're going to get your absolute peak performance in polishing. And it's not us trying to sell you more tools. Honestly, trust me on this. We love selling tools, don't get me wrong, but we don't have all these tools for the reason of trying to sell you more tools. We have these options because this is where peak performance exists. This is the best results you can expect by using different tools for different parts of the car. Okay, with that, I want to remind you also that everything we've been talking about, orbit sizes for polishing, RUPES also applies those orbit characteristics to sanding. So our Scorpio palm sander product line has a variety of orbits. They are considered, some of them are considered large in the whole sanding world, but those orbit characteristics apply to sanding as well. And that is why we have different orbit sizes for our sanders. With that, we're going to round the corner here and almost complete our message for you today, but I'm going to shift this back to Fabrizio in Italy because you're probably tired of hearing my voice.
Okay, no, we're not tired. We're never tired of you, Jason. Thank you for this very good explanation. And let's go to the new things, to the news about the Mark III. We called it Experience the Evolution of Excellence. Mark II, Mark I, they were already very good, very highly performing tools, but there is always something to make it perform better, always something to make it even more pleasant to use. So we decided to do the Mark III because we want to give you really the best opportunity to enjoy your polishing and your caring of the paint of a car. Let's go and see what are the new things. So Jason already explained you that we have some modifications in the speeds of the tools. On this, both on the 21 and on the 15, we have enhanced the minimum speed and reduced the maximum speed. Why? The minimum speed is because with the Mark I, Mark II, if you work at speed 1, you will experience a lot of vibrations. The tool is not intended to be used on that speed for a long time, only maybe at the very early stage, and then move to 3, 4, the recommended speed. So we have decided this time with the Mark III to have already the first speed which is usable, which is pleasant to use, which you can use without experiencing too many vibrations. And this was the decision of the company. So even if you work at 1, you have 3,000 orbits per minute, which is already a high speed, but low enough to avoid any problem of slinging of compound or other things like that, and having a good experience. What if you want to work at a lower speed? No problem. You can work at very low speed thanks to the presence of this new feature, which is the progressive triggers. So thanks to the progressive trigger, you can work at lower speed, and then work already at 1 with a very low action, with a very low stress to the pad, to the paint, if you want to be very gentle on the paint. All the rest doesn't change. Backing plate is the same of the Mark II and of the Mark I. Pad system and orbit size, they don't change. So the main change on this slide is the speed. We have reduced the maximum speed. Why? You know, we always recommend, for sure I do, and for sure Jason do, because we do a lot of courses together, and we always recommend to work at about 4, or speed 4, when you are cutting, when you are removing defects, and that for about 3 when you are finishing. I'm making a long story short now, but we can make this, make this statement. 4 for polish, for cutting, and 3 for finishing. What happens? Normally, body shops, and not only, there is a speed 6. Why not using it? So they just put it on 6 and work at 6. This is not something that we recommend, because working at very high speed will create to the system, pad, tool, paint, too much stress. So you reduce the lifetime of a pad, you reduce the durability of the whole system. So that's why we decided to reduce a little bit the 6, in order to let also the people who work always at speed 6 having creating not too many damages to the system. I remember, speed 6 is only for emergencies. I'm working on a curve, on a contours. I need the rotation is stalling. I need to make the rotation happen again. I will go up to 5 to 6 for a few seconds, for 10, 15, 20 seconds, and then when I go back to a flat surface, I will also go back to a speed 4, which is the recommended speed, average recommended speed. Let's go on. What other important features have changed? Yeah, the progressive trigger. This is important. Why it is important? Because you can change the speed also without adjusting the hand grip. So you can keep your hand at the normal position and change the speed only using the trigger. We have a large trigger. The trigger is large enough to let you have a good control of the speed. So you can easily control the speed just by changing the pressure that you apply on the trigger. What else? You have, it is very good, of course, in the priming stages when you are preparing the pad, or when you have to change the speed because you are working on a very complicated area. Then you can change the speed continuously without looking the tool, just by changing the pressure of the hand on the trigger. What else? We have improved the ergonomics. So the head of the tool is now anti-slip on both sides. So you can have a perfect managing, a perfect balancing of the tool with a very good feel, with a very good stability, experiencing even lower level of vibrations compared to Mark 1 and Mark 2, which already had very minor, very minimal levels. So with this, you can have a non-slip front grip, which is very useful for your job. Another thing, double foot here, double tool rest for a better protection of the tool in order to prevent to scratch the tool and to prevent to scratch the surfaces, the paint or the table or the surface where you put the tool on. Very stable when placed on carts, tables, and materials that you can move. In this way, you will avoid to let it fall down. So this is also an interesting improvement. The electronic module is tuned to deliver a lot of torque. You have very much torque, very good speed when you're working in the right range. You can see it easily because it's bigger than before. Before it was very, very thin. Now it's larger. So highly visibility, very easy to change it because it's made of rubber, not of plastic, so it's also non-slipping. A very interesting electronic module. The cord. Already we are doing it for the last versions of the Mark II and the Mark I, but for the Mark III it is the standard to have a 9-meter, 29.6 feet cord, long one. No need to use extension cords, no need to change the original situation. You can use 9 meters. Means that you can work all around the car without needing to change the plug, without needing to use any extension cord. So this has been very appreciated on the market, and it is a standard feature for all our Mark III polishers. So last slide, which is not going. Okay, why Mark III? Well, RUPES in its claim says innovation, technology, and design. Here we have design. We have a lot of design. The design of the Mark III goes in the same direction of the rotary. We have them on my back, the rotary LH19 and the gear-driven, the Mille, they have the same design, so we have harmonized the three systems with the same design. Innovation, technology, we have said new electronic module, new trigger, new things, and innovation. This is innovation. This is something more that you can get. So that's what we try to do. The Mark III is the result of our strive to improvement, of our fighting to get new solutions and to give you some new ways to work with better feelings, with more, with a better feeling, okay? Of course, the Mark III is an evolution, but nevertheless, RUPES decided to keep the same price level. Not the same price, but only minor, how do you say that? Only minor update to the price. Of course, the exact price you will have to ask to your local dealer, to your local distributor, but the price is not much different than the Mark II. And anyway, if you want to save money, the Mark I is always available, so you will have the possibility to get an entry-level tool buying the ES, or to have the state-of-the-art technology and the best possible qualities using the Mark III. So this is what you can do. Okay, I have finished my part. One recommendation: if you have questions, please write them now, because you are hearing us a little like 30 seconds after we are talking. It's not really live. So if you have questions, post them now so we have time to answer that to that at the end. This is the last slide. We have finished our presentation. I checked it a few minutes ago. There were more than 200 people hearing, and for sure many people will follow, because we had more than 800 subscriptions, which are numbers really awesome. And I thank all of you for following us and for joining us today. You know that for the 600 of people that are not following now, there is the possibility in the next days to watch it on demand. So if you, for the next time, that should be in April, you don't have the possibility to follow at the exact time, remember, you can subscribe and watch it the day after, 2 days after. I don't know how long, probably Dylan can be more precise on that, but you have some days that you can watch the webinar on demand. That's all from my side. For questions, I give the word back to Jason.
Thank you, Fabrizio. And by the way, George said we did a fantastic job. So I guess we did really good today. He said we did excellent. So I do want to point out before we get into questions that I did take a look at those of you that are in the live audience at this moment. And I see people from many other countries and cities outside of the US, cities across the United States. And I wanted to take a moment and say sincerely thank you, because I realize the time zone differences, and some of you are watching this at really early in the morning. Some of you are watching it really late at night, because I see participants from all over the globe, and that's fantastic, and we're honored that you took the time to do that. So I just want to say thanks. I do want to pull in Dylan at this point, and we're probably not able to answer all of the questions presented, but Dylan, you can take it from here.
Yeah, well, there's quite a few questions. And to answer Fabrizio's statement, the on-demand recording generally arrives via email to anybody who registered about 1 hour after we conclude here. It can vary based on the length of the presentation. Once you have that link, you can go back and watch that video as many times as you want, rewind it, fast forward, and all that kind of stuff. So without further ado, I'm going to push a few questions to the slide area for you, Jason. So let's go ahead and start with Hans here. He wants to know if he has a 15 and a nano, but he needs something in between. Should he consider a Duetto or a 75E? What would be a recommendation for a third tool in his lineup?
Well, it's a great question, and it also speaks to our ability as a family of tools to accommodate different scenarios. And there is no straight answer to your question. There's a kind of a general one. But if you've got the 15 and you have the Nano, you've got a full-size tool with a large orbit. You have a very small tool with large and small orbits. What would be in between is the Duetto and the Minis, but my recommendation would be the Mini because the performance you can get out of the Duetto has a bit of an overlap with what you already have, which is the 15 millimeter tool. So I would say the suggestion would be to get one of our Minis, which is either the electric LHR 75 or the pneumatic LHR 75, but either way, it's a 3-inch pad diameter, and that would be a great in-between Edgework tool for in addition to the tools you already have.
Can I say something? Jason has more the attitude of dealing with the detailers. I work more in Europe, more with body shop. What I would suggest is to buy a 21. Because you can do with a 75 what you can, or with a Nano, you can do roughly what you can do with a 75, but you cannot do with a 15 what you can do with a 21. The 21 is bigger, is faster, especially on large areas, big areas, very regular flat ones. So if it happens for you to run in rush or to work with a very big surface, big old cars, especially in the US, probably they are quite common, classic cars with very big hoods. The 21 gives you something more in terms of quick job, not because of the stroke, but because of the pad. As Jason was saying, between the 15 and the 21, you have an increase of 30, how much was? 36%?
33%.
33% more of area that you are working on. So the 21 could be the faster one when you have to do a quick job.
So there's two answers, both right. I think it just depends, again, on your particular scenario. And, you know, hallelujah for having options. We've given you plenty of tool options to accommodate your specific scenario. And it's all about peak performance. So it's dialing in the right tool for the right job.
Okay, so let's see. We've got a lot of questions. I'm going to try and cherry pick some of these. And for those of you we can't get to, again, there's over 200 of you on the presentation and more jumping in. So we'll do our best to get to as many of these as we can. So here's one we can push to the slide area from Brian. Wants to know if we still recommend foam pads over microfiber on both units. I think there's probably a little bit of a misunderstanding there because we don't specifically recommend either. It's situationally dependent.
Yeah, so the question is about different pad materials. Our recommendation is to use them all. So not because we're trying to sell you different pads, but there are definite strengths and weaknesses to the 3 pad materials: foam, microfiber, and wool. You know, some materials will perform better in some scenarios than others. So we don't actually, as a company, we don't recommend foam over any other material, although there might be a specific scenario where foam is recommended because it performs better in that scenario. So I hope that answers the question, that we really don't recommend one over the other. We do recommend certain materials for certain scenarios.
And I've got a number of questions from people wanting to rewatch some of the previous webinars. Both I've had people asking for Melee and also for the pad webinar. For those of us in the US, if you go to rupesusa.com/FAQ, as in frequently asked questions, we catalog all the webinars there for the US market. I believe, and Fabrizio, you might be able to answer this. I know the RUPES Global website, or not website, YouTube channel has an upload of all of the previous ones as well. So you can find them on the RUPES SPA YouTube. I don't know if they're housed anywhere on the website specifically outside of the US, but for those of you guys asking that, because there's about 10 of you, so that answers those questions. Another question, actually, this is actually a fairly good one to address because I hear this often. The quote-unquote problem of stalling fixed with Mark III. Do you want to speak to the problem of stalling, Jason?
Yeah, it's a big problem. What do you say, George? Is it a problem? So actually, it's not a problem. So the rotation stall is a very important feature built into all dual action random orbital tools, not just RUPES, BigFoots, but all of them. Any dual action random orbital tool has a built-in safety feature, and it's called rotation stall. So it is your friend in a lot of situations, because with angle, with pressure, with contoured body panels, in certain scenarios, that rotation will stall. It basically will slow down or stop. And that is a very valued safety feature. If that engineering feature was not built into this type of tool and we had a forced rotation scenario, that movement would just power through into the paint and potentially cause damage, depending on the paint thickness and the area that you're in. So the fact that it stalls is not a problem, okay? Now let's talk about answering this question with respect to our large orbit dual action random orbital polishers. With a large orbit scenario, the orbit, as Fabrizio mentioned earlier in the webinar, the orbit is the workhorse. The orbit is doing the bulk of the work. The rotation is adding movement, and it's a safety feature, the fact that it's random, it's adding cooling ability, but the orbit is the primary dominant movement of the tool. So momentary pad stall, so if you're polishing along on a fender and you get into a curve or a contour and the rotation stalls momentarily, this is not a problem. Momentary stall is okay. You power through that particular space on the fender. Maybe if you want, you reach over and crank up the speed dial to give you more motor speed, which will increase your rotation or the potential for rotation. And this would help you power through in that scenario. But the point I'm making is momentary pad stall, not a problem. The problem exists if you have pad stall and you do a whole car that way. In other words, too much angle, too much pressure, but you have a pad stall scenario and you're doing the whole car that way. That will stress components, that will heat up components, it will heat up the paint, it will do things that the tool is not really intended to do. So to describe it as a problem, we just want to encourage you, it's not a problem. It's only a problem if you have pad stall on the entire vehicle or for long periods of time. But momentary pad stall, it's actually a blessing that it happens because it's helping you to safely polish paint.
Okay, let's see. We got lots more. I'm trying to find some good ones in here. Actually, this is a question we didn't address. Let's push that to slide area. Heat generation difference between the 21 and the 15.
Heat generated. So I have to make an assumption on this question because I don't know. All polishing tools of any type, rotary, force rotation, random orbitals, they all generate heat. But it's the question is, where does the heat go once it's generated? Now with rotary, the heat that's generated is between the pad and the paint surface, and the heat is then pushed in really into the paint. With random orbitals, the heat that's generated tends to go up into the pad material and the backing plate. And actually the hottest or the warmest temperatures measured in this polishing process for random orbital is between the pad and the backing plate. So relatively speaking, the heat at the surface would be considered less for random orbital compared to other type movements. But between the 15 and the 21, I think because of pad diameter, you can expect more heat at the surface simply because there's more contact of the pad making contact to the paint surface. So that would mean more surface friction and more heat generated. But generally speaking, the temperatures measured at the paint surface is a lot less than what you would expect with rotary and other type of force rotation tools, because the heat then goes away from the paint and into the pad and into the backing plate. Hopefully that answered that.
I think so. That's a good answer. So this is actually an interesting question here. Gentleman with a 15 ES taking out 3,000 grit sanding marks. Just talking to the capability of the 15 ES versus sanding marks, I guess, and in justification for maybe a slightly more powerful tool.
Well, on a 3,000 grit sanding mark, which by the way, is a variable. So even though you're applying 3,000 grit, you can apply 3,000 grit on 10 different cars and actually get 10 different sanding marks, or not 10, probably 3 or 4 different sanding marks in terms of depth and the coarseness of the sanding mark. So the defect is a moving target a little bit, but if you have the 15, and the question is, what is the best tool for polishing out 3,000 grit? I think the 15 and the 21 are both very, very capable of removing 3,000 grit sanding marks. We do it all the time. Lots of you in the audience do it all the time. So it's not a matter of the 15 versus 21 and which is the better way to go after 3,000 grit. The question more is, what size vehicles, what size area do you want to cover? Because the bigger the vehicle, the more area that you desire to cover while removing 3,000 grit, you're going to lean towards the 21 millimeter version of the tool. If you're on smaller vehicles or an isolated 3,000 grit sanding mark, the 15 millimeter would perform better in that scenario. So best tool for 3,000 grit, answer is they both do 3,000 grit all the time.
All right, we'll do maybe 1 or 2 more, and then we will get to the end of this, since I'm sure everybody has things to get to today. Let's see here. We're going to push this one out. The wool pad on the 21 is experiencing some heat issues. Any tips for managing heat?
Get warm very quickly. Okay, so because of surface area, again, we were talking about that pad diameter difference between the 21 and the 15. The new wool pads, you're getting warm quickly. Well, it could be a technique adjustment. It depends on what compound you're using, because some compounds will create more surface heat than others. If you find that you're getting too much heat and it appears to be more heat than you want, there's some very good slight technique adjustments that you can do. One of them is downward pressure. The other one is tool speed. The other one is pad angle. So you can make an adjustment on, pressure, tool speed, or pad angle, and that should cool down the pad. One tip in our advanced class that we do teach is the tool speed could be the maximum tool speed, the lowest tool speed on the tool that maintains pad rotation. And with the wool pad, you're going to expect more pad drag because of its fibers. So it might need a little bit more tool speed. But if you simply adjust your tool speed down until the moment that you lose pad rotation and then kick it up a little bit, that's the ideal speed. And a lot of people find out that tool speed is lower than they expected. So many of you use the tool at 5 and 6 all the time. And what we're saying is that's not necessary. And you're probably heating up components unnecessarily, because you can get peak performance down around speed number 4. So that's one thing for this particular questioner, the person asking this question, is adjust technique to reduce that surface temperature and the pad temperature.
Jason, yes, I agree with you. Only one more thing that I would add. I know I know what this guy is experiencing on the blue wool pad. This is an incredibly fast cutting pad. It has a very fast defect removal, thanks to the kind of pile it has, but also thanks to the rigid foam that it is on the back. This high cut removal, of course, has a side effect, which is the high temperature that goes on the paint, and especially, as you just said, on the pad itself and on this part of the pad, which is the foam, that tends to become hot, and you might experience a very fast worn out of the pad. So that's why I suggest for people who has this kind of problem and even changing the technique doesn't see a real improvement of the lifetime of the pad, to try the yellow foam, the yellow wool. Yellow wool is longer, the pile, but also is much softer, more elastic, the foam on the back. So one tip is just changing from the blue to the yellow. You will not lose a lot of cut, especially if you use the same compound. The difference is really minor. But you will have a longer lifetime for the pad.
Yeah, that's thanks for adding that comment. So that George, by the way, agrees with you, Fabrizio. He thinks that's a very good suggestion.
I think we'll take one last one because there was a lot of questions centered around this, as we knew there would be tool modifications. But Jose wants to know, he understands that there's an increase in vibration and a reduction in pad coverage, but how does it change the performance on the panel? Less pad drag, more rotation, that kind of stuff. Again, not recommended, but if you do it, what can he expect?
Okay, so the question is on the 21 millimeter tool, we're changing it to the smaller backing plate. He understands that it may increase vibration and reduce coverage. What does it do performance? That's the question.
Yep. Yeah. Well, I mean, what's the actual performance result, not considering vibration and things?
Well, it's a very tricky thing to calculate, and it would also be a variable depending on the defect and the paint. But I think all things being the same, you're going to find that pad diameter reduction on a dual action tool is an increase in aggressiveness. So that's true of any dual action random orbital. If you're taking a larger diameter going to a smaller diameter, all other things being exactly the same, the one change that you can expect is a little more aggressiveness simply because of pad diameter. Now, the opposite is true of rotary tools. It's a whole nother conversation, but the larger your pad diameter, the more aggressiveness you can expect. So I think, you know, if you bracket orbit size and you only thought about the pad diameter, you would expect slightly more aggressiveness for that reason by downsizing to a smaller diameter.
All right. Well, I'll wrap it there, and I apologize that there's just so many questions, guys. We can't possibly answer them all on the webinar, but you do have the contact information for Fabrizio, Jason, and myself on there. That also here is the main ways to reach RUPES in the U.S., RUPES USA, and all of our contact information there on the right. And then if you're outside the U.S., our main offices in Italy, where Fabrizio's at. So if you didn't get your question addressed here, you can definitely shoot us an email or contact us on one of those channels, and we can address it after the fact. Getting a lot of thank yous to Fabrizio and Jason. I agree, you guys did a fantastic job. Jason, if you don't mind, I'm going to steer for a minute. We just want to ask those of you that are still here, almost 200 of you still, just give us a quick rating on what you thought of the content today. I'm seeing a lot of positive comments, but vote. You know, if you thought this was extremely helpful, give it a 5. If it was, you thought you knew everything and we just bored you for an hour and 18 minutes, then give us a not at all. But we hope you enjoyed the content. I'll leave that up for just a few moments. Okay. And lastly, thank you. Or grazie mille. Thank you guys for everything. Jason, Fabrizio, fantastic job as usual. And for everybody who's on, you'll be receiving the on-demand copy here soon, so you can watch it again if you missed anything. And stay tuned. There'll be social media and email announcements of the next webinar. Jason, do we have a date on that yet? Is it next month we're planning on?
Yeah, it'll be later next month. I don't remember the exact date, but we will publish.
Yep. So keep us. Thank you, everybody, for attending. We'll see you on the next one.